You ever have one of those nights that starts like any other and then without warning rips the floor out from under you? That was a Saturday for us. I was behind the wheel of our black luxury SUV, the kind that glides, not roars, and beside me was my wife, Dr. Lila Archer, who had just finished the kind of 12-hour shift that burns into your bones and somehow still leaves you smiling. In the passenger seat, our lives looked ordinary. Tired hands left over hospital coffee plans for takeout, and then the red and blue lights bloomed behind us like a bad omen. "License and registration," the officer barked without a greeting. The flashlight hit Lila's face like a slap. She kept her hands on the wheel. Slow, deliberate, the way someone who has held tiny beating hearts in her palms for years moves when she wants to stay alive. "Good evening, officer," she said, calm as a church bell. "May I ask why I was stopped?" "Did I tell you to speak?" he snapped back. His partner snickered in the cruiser. Right away, something in the air changed. It wasn't about traffic. It was about power and a man who'd learned he could take it out on other people. Let me paint the scene for you. The kind of small, affluent neighborhood where lawns are manicured like flags, and people expect drivers to be polite and invisible. Lila had been at the children's hospital all day. 3 surgeries, 2 that went exactly as she prayed, 1 that nearly didn't. She'd scrubbed in until her arms ached, she'd stitched and suture danced a tiny beating heart back into rhythm. She'd cried quietly once in a supply closet when the girl opened her eyes and smiled at her. That was Lila. Save lives, bury the rest until later. I was on my tablet skimming personnel files for work stuff. I'm Aaron Ellis, the newly appointed police chief of our small city, Crestford, when a notification flashed complaint review, Officer D. Martin. I glanced, closed it, set it down. We were both tired. We wanted dinner and to forget a day that had felt like years. But sometimes the world asks otherwise. The officer at our window approached like he owned the pavement. 30-something badge, square voice, thick with the satisfaction of being obeyed. He aimed his flashlight like a spotlight, not to see better, but to dominate. "License and registration now," he repeated, as if the first time hadn't been clear. Lila moved like someone who has rehearsed survival interior light on window down. Hands on the wheel, voice steady. "I'm a pediatric cardiac surgeon," she said when he rifled through the car like it was a flea market. "I specialize in congenital defects. I performed 3 surgeries today." He looked at her like she'd told him she was a unicorn. Sure, that's cute." Then he laughed. The laugh was the worst part. The casual dismissal that said she didn't belong there, that her credentials were a punchline. "Who's that in the passenger seat?" he barked, shining his light quick enough to catch my face. 1 second. That's all it took for him to decide I wasn't worth another glance. Boyfriend, husband, whatever. You could feel the contempt like a physical thing. You could feel the message clear as day. People like you don't belong here. It stung, but we were used to that kind of look. Lila always joked she could operate blindfolded because she practiced staying composed while the world assumed she was nothing. Then he did what some officers do when they want to manufacture an encounter. He said we failed to signal when changing lanes. Lila had signaled. She always did. But that didn't matter. The dash cam in his cruiser was malfunctioning. Later, we'd learned he'd flipped it off before pulling us over. He ordered her out. "Get out of the car." Hands on the hood. "Turn around." Lila followed every instruction like a surgeon following a protocol. Slow, announced visible hands, no sudden moves. Still, he grabbed her arm, spun her cussed in a way that was unnecessary, invasive. He patted her down in public long enough to humiliate. He cuffed her. Those cold metal bites leaving red crescents on the wrists of the woman who'd spent her life putting life back into others. People filmed. Phones popped up like mushrooms after rain. Some laughed. Some did nothing. Some commented with quick outrage and faster distraction. I reached for the console, the silver that sits there in case of emergency. My badge. I thought about flashing it, stopping this faster than social media ever could. But then I thought about the hundreds of people who didn't have a badge to flash. About the dozen names on that complaint folder I just glanced at. About a system that protected its own. So I stayed seated. I watched. I learned. I wanted to see what happens when no one thinks you're important enough to notice. That's when it escalated. The officer pulled his cuffs, slapped them on Lila tighter than needed, and announced she was under arrest, resisting obstruction whatever fit the script. I stood up. "Officer," I said, calm, my hands visible. "She's my wife. You have no probable cause." He snapped, "Back up or you'll join her, last warning." He was looking for compliance. He wanted to be obeyed, not questioned. "Unhand her," I said. "Apologize for what you just did." He laughed again, like I was a joke. That laugh turned into something dangerous when he realized he could charge me for resisting. Before I knew it, he slammed me to the pavement like I was trash, cuffed me with the same hardware he'd used on my wife, and announced to anyone listening, 2 suspects, possible stolen vehicle. The crowd murmured, phones streamed, and a man who'd signed my promotion letters watched his city shrink around him. That's the thing that should make you sit up. The man who cuffed me didn't know who he was cuffing. At first, he bristled with the power of being right. Then, recognition hit him like an anvil. The color drained from his face. The same breath he used to bark at us turned into a stammer when another officer arrived and said, "Chief Ellis." "That's Chief Ellis." The officer's face collapsed into shame, then fear. He went from domineering to pleading in a matter of seconds. I stood up, hands still shaking from the rough handling, and addressed the crowd and the cameras and the officer who'd treated my wife like she was invisible. "You didn't recognize me." I said every syllable quiet and deliberate. "You didn't see my wife for who she is. You made assumptions because of how we look. You decided who belonged and who didn't." He sank to his knees, words spilling out. But Lila walked up to him and didn't soften. She lifted her wrists to show the marks and asked simple, sharp, "What do your hands do, officer? What have you ever given anyone besides fear?" That question landed harder than a verdict. It forced him to look past his uniform and into the harm he'd inflicted. The fallout was textbook when the video hit the feeds. Outrage investigations, calls for resignations, and a flood of people coming forward who'd been treated the same way for years. The officer was suspended, then charged. An internal culture that had protected bad behavior began to crack open. The sergeant, who'd brushed off complaints for years, found himself under scrutiny. Policies changed, body cams became mandatory in all traffic stops in our city. Civilian oversight committees got teeth, and an early warning system for repeat complaints went into place. One officer who'd been silent, who had watched and done nothing, stepped forward and testified. It cost her plenty. She lost friends. She received threats. But she also found her voice and later led training to teach others what she'd been too afraid to say earlier. Sometimes courage looks like whistleblowing. Sometimes it looks like telling the truth even when it's messy. Here's what I want to be absolutely clear about. This wasn't a silver bullet victory. It didn't magically fix everything. It exposed one rotten part and forced a reckoning, but there's a long road ahead. There are still people being stopped, searched, humiliated, whose stories never make a headline. There are still officers whose conduct is hidden behind paperwork and procedural delays. The reforms helped, yes, but the deeper work, the day-to-day culture, the assumptions, the biases that make people feel less than human, that takes generations. So why tell you this? Because it's easy to watch a clip and feel righteously angry for a day, then click away. Justice doesn't begin and end with outrage. It starts when we commit to small things, knowing your rights during a traffic stop, recording interactions when it's safe to do so, supporting independent oversight in your city, and, crucially, not letting others be invisible. If you see something, say something. If you don't know what to say, at least don't be part of the crowd that looks away. Before I go, I want to ask you something. Have you ever witnessed an injustice and stayed quiet? Tell me why. Or better, tell me about a time you spoke up even when it was scary. Which felt harder? Silence or action? Drop it in the comments. Be honest. Be raw. I read every single one. If this story landed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. And remember, dignity isn't reserved for the famous, the powerful, or the well-connected. It's owed to everyone. When we stop pretending otherwise, maybe that's how we start changing things for the better.